The letter hit the table between them like a knife. Winifred Shepherd did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching was a luxury she could not afford, and Louis Shelby's gray eyes had gone cold as January Creek water, staring at her across that scarred wooden surface in the dim office of the Double Horn Ranch. The oil lamp between them threw long shadows across his jaw, and the paper lying open between them held her handwriting, every careful, deliberate word she had written 6 weeks ago when she had applied for the position of ranch physician and field medic. "You lied to me," he said. His voice was low and even, which was somehow worse than shouting. "I did not lie," Winifred said, and her voice did not shake either, though her hands beneath the table were pressing flat against her thighs. "I omitted one detail. One detail." Louis stood then, pushing back his chair so hard it scraped against the floorboards, and he walked to the window where the last light of the Colorado evening was burning itself out over the ridge. "You omitted the fact that you are a woman." The letter said W. Shepherd. It said 10 years of medical training and field experience. It said I have sutured wounds, extracted infected teeth, and crossed the Cimarron River alone in flood season to reach a patient who would have died otherwise. Every single word in that letter was the truth. He turned then, and she saw something in his face that was not quite anger. It was something more complicated than anger, something that looked almost like fear wearing anger's coat. "I have 43 men on this ranch, Winifred. 43 men who have not seen a woman up close in months. Do you understand what you are walking into?" "Do you understand?" she said, rising from her own chair and meeting his gaze with the full force of years of surviving things that should have broken her. "That you have 2 ranch hands with infected wounds, one foreman with an abscessed molar that is going to kill him if it goes untreated another week, and a cattle drive heading into the San Juan Mountains in 11 days with no medical support whatsoever. I understand exactly what I am walking into, Mr. Shelby. The question is whether you are too proud to let me help you." The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. And that was how it began, not gently, not with ceremony, but with a woman refusing to back down and a man who did not yet know that the force meeting his resistance was the most significant thing that had ever walked through his door. But to understand how Winifred Shepherd came to stand in that lamplit office in Hatcher County, Colorado, in the spring of 1882, you have to understand where she came from and what the road behind her had cost her. She had been born in Cincinnati, the eldest daughter of a physician father who believed, quietly and stubbornly against the opinions of his era, that his daughter's mind was as capable as any man's. Dr. Elias Shepherd had taught Winifred anatomy at the kitchen table, had let her observe surgeries from the doorway when she was 12, and had pressed medical textbooks into her hands the way other fathers pressed needlework into their daughters' hands. By 17, she could set a compound fracture. By 20, she had delivered 11 babies. By 23, when her father died of typhoid fever and left her with nothing but his medical bag, his library, and a deep, irreversible knowledge of how fragile and how stubborn the human body was, she had found herself adrift in a world that did not want to pay for what she could do. The Eastern medical colleges would not take her. The hospitals in Cincinnati and Columbus and Pittsburgh treated her inquiries with polite condescension. She could work as a nurse, they told her. She could assist. Winifred Shepherd did not assist. She had never been built for assisting. So she had gone west, the way that people with nothing to lose and everything to prove tended to go, and she had spent the years between 23 and 29 building a reputation that moved ahead of her like a weather front. You heard she was coming before she arrived, and when she got there, things got better. She had worked cattle towns and mining camps and 2 different army outposts that looked the other way about her gender, because she was the only person within 100 miles who knew what to do when gangrene set in. She had learned the hard way that the frontier did not care much about the conventions that Cincinnati held sacred. The frontier cared about whether you could keep people alive. She had stitched wounds in firelight with her kit open on a saddle blanket. She had pulled an infected molar from the jaw of a man twice her size who was screaming and thrashing, holding his head between her knees while she worked the extraction forceps, and she had done it without flinching and without apology. She had forded the Cimarron alone in flood season, her horse swimming hard against the current, her medical bag held above her head, to reach a woman laboring in breech presentation 12 miles from the nearest settlement, and she had saved that woman's life and the baby's life both. She had done all of it alone. That was the part that people did not understand about Winifred, the part that lived in the quiet center of her that she rarely showed anyone. She had become so capable of surviving alone, so expert at it, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to need someone else. She had sealed that need off like she would seal a wound cleanly, efficiently, without sentiment, because need was a vulnerability she could not afford when she was the only person standing between someone and death. She was 29 years old in the spring of 1882, and she had not let herself truly need another person in 6 years. The advertisement she had found in the Denver paper had been terse and direct, which she appreciated. It read, "Physician and field medic needed for large cattle operation in Hatcher County. Must be capable of independent work and long travel. Significant experience required. Apply in writing to L. Shelby, Double Horn Ranch. No mention of gender. No mention of any requirement that the applicant be male." She had written her letter carefully, signed it W. Shepard, and sent it without particular hope, because hope was another thing she had learned to ration carefully. When the reply came saying she had the position, starting wage of $40 a month with board, she had packed her 2 bags, loaded her medical kit, and ridden 3 days to Hatcher County. She had not anticipated Lewis Shelby. That was not accurate. She had anticipated something of him, an employer, a rancher, a man who needed something she could provide. What she had not anticipated was the way he filled a room, not with swagger or bluster the way so many men out here seem to think was required, but with a kind of dense, serious gravity, like he was a feature of the landscape rather than a person standing in it. He was 34 years old, tall without using his height to loom over people, with dark hair going silver at the temples earlier than it ought to, and a face that had been weathered by work and weather into something that was not conventionally handsome but was deeply, arresting in a way that Winifred found immediately and inconveniently distracting. His hands were what she noticed first, because she always noticed hands. It was a physician's habit. Hands told you everything. Lewis Shelby's hands were large and scarred and capable, the hands of a man who worked alongside his men rather than above them. There was a healed burn across the back of his left hand that she recognized as a rope burn from a fast-moving steer. There was a notch taken out of his right index finger that spoke of either a blade or a moving machine part. He had lived in his body hard, and his body had kept him. She had noticed all of this in the 2 minutes before he noticed the shape of the name on her letter did not match the shape of the person standing in his doorway, and everything had crystallized into that confrontation. The letter on the table, his cold gray eyes, her refusal to apologize for being exactly who she was. In the long silence after she had challenged him with the truth about his sick men and his coming cattle drive, he had stood at the window with his back to her for what felt like a very long time. She had not moved. She had learned that stillness was a kind of strength, that waiting without visibly waiting was a form of winning. When he turned around, something in his face had shifted. "I have conditions," he said. "Tell me your conditions." "You will have your own quarters in the house, separate from the bunkhouse. My housekeeper, Mrs. Otero, will be present in the house at all times. You will carry a firearm. I will not have any man on this ranch give you trouble, but I am asking you to be sensible about your situation." "I have been sensible about my situation since I was 23 years old," Winifred said. "I also already carry a firearm, a .41 caliber Colt revolver, if you need the specifics." Something moved across his face then that she would later identify as the beginning of a complicated admiration. He looked at her for another moment. $40 a month with board, he said, same as the letter said. I know, she said. Welcome to the Double Horn Ranch, W. Shepherd. Thank you, Mr. Shelby. She had been careful in those first days to be exactly professional and nothing more. She had set up the small room off the main house that he had designated as a medical space, organizing her instruments and supplies with the precise, economical efficiency of someone who had done it many times in many imperfect locations. She had introduced herself to the ranch hands with the same level, unflinching manner she brought to everything, and she had watched them process the unexpected reality of her with varying speeds. Some of them had taken it in stride with the philosophical practicality of men who had seen enough of the frontier to stop expecting it to match their assumptions. Some of them had looked at Louis Shelby with expressions that asked questions he answered with a single flat look that stopped the questions cold. The two men with infected wounds were her first priority. One was a young cowhand named Benny Carver, barely 20, with a deep slash on his forearm that had been improperly cleaned and was now swollen and hot and showing the early signs of blood poisoning. The other was an older man, stocky and weathered, named Pete Alderman, who had a puncture wound in his calf from a fence post. She cleaned both wounds with carbolic solution, repacked them, and told both men clearly and without softening it what would have happened to them within another week without treatment. Young Benny went pale. Pete Alderman looked at her with the kind of gratitude that comes from a man who has been frightened but refused to admit it. The foreman was named Hector Vega, a man of 40-something with a jawline swollen on the left side and eyes that had the particular haunted quality of someone who has been in significant pain long enough that they have started to accommodate it as a normal state of being. He submitted to her examination with a stoic, controlled stillness that she respected. "How long has this tooth been giving you trouble?" she asked, pressing gently along his jaw with her fingers, feeling the heat radiating from the abscess. "Couple of months," he said through clenched teeth. "More than a couple," she said. She was not accusing him, just stating what the swelling told her. She could feel the abscess, could feel the extent of the infection, and she understood why he had been managing it silently. Men out here did not stop for pain. Pain was considered a private matter, something you absorbed and worked through, and admitting to it felt like a kind of failure she had seen kill more men than the pain itself had. "I need to extract it," she told him. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." "Today," he said, and the decisiveness of it told her that the pain had reached the point where he was willing to do anything to end it. She extracted the tooth that afternoon with Hector sitting in a chair in the bright light of the open doorway, his hands gripping his own knees, her extraction forceps working with the careful, deliberate pressure she had learned through years of practice. It took 15 minutes, and it was not a comfortable 15 minutes for either of them. But when the tooth came free with its roots and the abscess drained, the relief on Hector Vega's face was so profound and immediate that it was almost moving to witness. Louis Shelby was standing in the doorway when it was done, she realized. She did not know how long he had been there. She cleaned her instruments without looking at him. "How is he?" Louis asked Hector. "She," Hector said thickly, still pressing a cloth to his jaw, "is very good." She heard Louis step away from the doorway without another word, and she told herself that the warmth that moved through her chest at that was simply the satisfaction of work done well, and had nothing at all to do with Louis Shelby's opinion of her. She told herself that for about 3 more days before she stopped believing it. The ranch was larger than she had imagined from the advertisement, sprawling across a wide valley that backed up against a series of pine-covered ridges, with a creek running through the eastern edge of the property that was cold and clean even in spring runoff. The cattle numbered close to 800 head, and the operation that Louis ran was efficient and serious without being brutal. She could see that in the way his men worked, in the fact that they worked hard because they respected him rather than because they feared him. That was rarer than it should have been, and it told her something about the man's character that she found herself thinking about more than she intended. She learned his story in pieces, the way you learned anything real about people out here, gradually and indirectly, from the spaces around what they said rather than from what they said directly. He had built the double horn from a single section of land he had bought with the proceeds of 5 years of working other men's cattle drives, starting at 19 years old and working every cattle trail from Texas to Kansas until he understood the business from the inside out. He had no family in Colorado. His parents were dead. He had a sister somewhere in Missouri who he sent money to twice a year and corresponded with in letters that took months to travel in each direction. He had been married once, briefly, when he was 26, to a woman named Clara who had come west with him when the double horn was still more ambition than actuality, and who had died of a fever in the second winter before she had seen the ranch become what he had promised her it could be. He never talked about Clara. But Mrs. Otero, the housekeeper, was a woman in her 50s who had been with the ranch for 8 years and who had known Clara, and who told Winifred about her in the quiet, careful way of someone who is sharing something precious. He built the east wing of the house after she died, Mrs. Otero said one evening while they were both in the kitchen. He said he had promised her a house big enough for a family, and he was going to build it even if she never got to see it. He has not touched the room he said would be hers. She paused, the way people paused before saying something that mattered. He has not had anyone in this house long enough to matter in 8 years, Miss Shepherd. Winifred had held that information carefully, the way she held anything fragile, and she had not known then what to do with it, only that it had changed something in the shape of how she looked at Lewis Shelby when she did not think he was looking. The cattle drive into the San Juan Mountains was 11 days away when she arrived, and in those 11 days she had her work cut out for her. Beyond the 3 immediate medical cases, she had discovered that the overall health of the ranch hands was typical for their situation. A collection of old injuries never properly treated, nutritional deficiencies, several men with eye problems from years of working in bright sun and dust, one man with a heart condition he did not know about that she identified by listening to his chest with her stethoscope, and that required an immediate, serious conversation. That man's name was Walt Greer, 51 years old, and the conversation went differently than she expected. "You are telling me I am dying," Walt said. He was sitting on a hay bale in the barn, his shirt unbuttoned, watching her pack away her stethoscope. "I am telling you that you have a heart that is working harder than it should, and that if you continue the kind of physical labor you are currently doing, you are shortening your life significantly. I am also telling you that if you reduce your exertion, avoid the heat when possible, and take things more carefully, you may have many more years ahead of you. Can I still ride? Lightly, not hard driving." Walt was quiet for a moment. "You going to tell Mr. Shelby? That is your information to share," she said. "I can tell you what I observed medically. What you do with it is your decision. But I would suggest that Mr. Shelby would want to know because he would not want to put a man in danger." Walt had told Lewis himself that evening, which confirmed what she had suspected about both of them, that Lewis Shelby ran a place where honesty was possible without fear, and that Walt Greer had enough respect for the man to give him that honesty even when it was hard to give. Lewis had come to find her afterward, and he had stood in the doorway of the medical room while she was cataloging her supplies for the drive. "Walt Greer," he said. "Yes. Is he going to be all right? If he is careful," she looked up from her list, "he needs to be put on lighter duty, permanently. I suspect you already know how to do that without making him feel like he is being put out to pasture." Lewis was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that expression she had already started to recognize, the one where he was thinking several things at once and showing none of them on his face except in the subtle shift around his eyes. "You are very good at your work," he said. It was not a compliment she had expected in that moment, and because she was not expecting it, it landed differently than compliments usually did. It went past her professional surface and touched something underneath it. "Thank you," she said, and looked back at her list before he could see whatever had happened to her face. The morning the drive set out, Winifred rose before dawn and had her kit packed and loaded on her mule, a steady, obstinate animal she had named Reason, because it was the most reliable thing she owned, before most of the hands were out of the bunkhouse. The drive would take them up into the mountain passes through terrain that made every kind of accident more likely and more serious, and she had spent the days before departure rereading her notes on altitude sickness, bone fractures from falls, the treatment of frostbite in late spring mountain conditions, and snake bite protocols, because the high country had its own specific dangers, and she intended to be prepared for all of them. Lewis found her checking Reason's load in the gray pre-dawn light. "You know this will be hard going," he said, not as a warning exactly, more as a statement of fact he wanted on the record. "I have been on 3 cattle drives before this one," she said. "I know what hard going looks like." He stood beside her for a moment in the cold morning air, and she could feel him thinking, weighing something. He had a quality of careful deliberateness that she had come to find unexpectedly comforting. He did not act on impulse. He did not bluster. He thought before he spoke, and he meant what he said when he said it. "If anything goes wrong up there," he said quietly, "I want to know you will tell me." She looked at him then, because there was something in the way he said it that was not about the drive specifically. "I will tell you," she said. And then the sun cracked over the eastern ridge and the drive began. The San Juan Mountains in late spring were a thing of savage, indifferent beauty, and Winifred was old enough and experienced enough to appreciate both the beauty and the indifference equally. The passes were steep and the trails narrow, and the cattle moved up them with the reluctant, heavy insistence of animals that do not want to go where they are being pushed, which meant the cowboys were working hard and working at angles on rocky terrain, which was exactly the kind of situation where people got hurt. On the 3rd day into the drive, a hand named Carlos Moda took a fall from his horse on a switchback, going down the slope until a boulder stopped him. Winifred was at his side within minutes, working quickly in the way she worked when time was what mattered most, hands moving fast but with precision, her mind already several steps ahead of her hands, assessing and planning. His wrist was broken, she determined, and he had a significant cut across his scalp that was bleeding dramatically in the way that scalp wounds did, producing far more blood than was actually lost, so that the man looked more critically injured than he was. She cleaned the wound, closed it with her curved, suturing needle and thread working steadily in the mountain light, and splinted the wrist. Carlos watched her work with dark, calm eyes. "You are good at this," he said. "So I have been told," she said. "Mr. Shelby said before we left you were the toughest person he had hired in 12 years of running this ranch." She missed a stitch. Not badly enough to matter, but she noticed it, and she was careful about her work and did not usually miss stitches. "He said that," she said, keeping her voice level and professional, "to Hector. I was not meant to hear it." Carlos looked almost apologetic. "But the bunkhouse walls are thin." She finished the suture and tied it off cleanly. She sat back on her heels in the mountain grass, and she looked at the distant peaks, and she thought about Lewis Shelby saying that about her, and something happened in her chest that she had not felt in long enough that she almost did not recognize it. It was not simple pleasure at a professional compliment. It was something warmer and more complicated than that, something that made her feel seen in a way that she had not realized she was hungry for. She was 39 miles from the Double Horn Ranch, sitting in a mountain pass suturing a cowhand's scalp wound, and she was thinking about her employer's hands and the things he said when he did not think she could hear him. This, she told herself firmly, is not something you can afford. She told herself that several more times over the days that followed, and believed it less each time. Lewis rode near her more than was strictly necessary as the drive pushed higher into the mountains. He never made it obvious. She would have respected it less if he had, but She was a physician and a woman who had spent years reading people, and she was acutely aware of where he was at any given moment in the way that you became acutely aware of something that your body had decided was important before your mind caught up. He checked in on her at the end of each day, asking in that direct, economy of words way of his whether she had everything she needed, whether the conditions were manageable, whether anything required his attention. He noticed when she was tired, which was not something she advertised, and on the fifth evening he appeared at her campfire with a tin cup of coffee and sat down across from her without being asked, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the drive or the cattle or medicine. He told her about the first time he had come to Colorado, 15 years ago, barely 20 years old, and how the mountains had looked to him like a promise or a dare. He was not sure which. He told her about the winter Clara had died, not the details of it but the shape of it, the way the world had contracted afterward into something he had kept very small and very manageable for a long time, because anything larger than manageable had felt dangerous. He did not say this with self-pity. He said it the way he said most things, factually and without performance, and it was exactly that quality that undid her a little more. She told him things in return about her father and the kitchen table anatomy lessons, about the medical colleges that had refused her, about the Cimarron crossing, about the patients she had lost and the ones she had saved, and how the weight of both of those things sat differently in her body. She had not talked about these things in a long time. There had been nobody to talk about them with, and she had thought she was accustomed to that. "You should have been able to study formally," he said, when she was quiet. "That was wrong." "Yes," she said, "it was, and you built what you have anyway. I did not have a choice." "You always have a choice," he said. "Some people would have accepted what they were told and gone home. You went west." The fire was low between them, and the mountain air was cold and sharp, and the sky above was extraordinary with stars, and Winifred Shepherd looked at Louis Shelby across that fire and understood, with the particular clarity that came from being completely honest with herself, that she was in very serious trouble. She went asleep that night with the discomforting realization settled firmly in her chest like a stone she was going to have to learn to carry. The crisis came on the 8th day. The drive had crossed the highest point of the pass and was starting down toward the lower mountain valleys, where the grazing land was that Louis was driving toward, and the going on the descent was treacherous loose rock, switchbacks that were barely wide enough for a horse, cattle that were increasingly difficult to control as the trail narrowed. She was riding near the back of the drive on reason, her medical kit immediately accessible, watching the terrain with the careful attention she gave everything, when she heard the sound she had been dreading, a crash, a shout, and the specific sound of horses in panic that carried on mountain air with horrible clarity. There was a gap in the line of riders where Louis had been. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move, pressing reason forward along the trail edge with more speed than was probably wise, her heart doing something she refused to dignify by naming it, and she found the scene around the next switchback. Louis's horse had slipped on a rock shelf and gone down, and Louis had gone with it, and both were down on a ledge 6 feet below the trail where the mountain slope broke in a narrow shelf before dropping another 30 feet to a creek bed. The horse was struggling to get up. Louis was not struggling, he was still. "Hold the cattle back," she said to the nearest hands, and she dismounted, and she was over the edge and down onto the ledge before anyone could argue with her, moving with the careful, deliberate speed of someone who knew that haste and this terrain were a bad combination. She reached Louis and dropped to her knees beside him, and her hands were already moving airway, breathing, circulation, and she was talking herself through it in the steady internal voice she used when she needed to be a physician, and not whatever else she was terrified of being in this moment. He was breathing. That was the first thing. He was breathing, and his pulse was present and fast, which was shock, but it was alive. "Louis," she said. His name came out without the Mr. in front of it for the first time, and she could not take it back and did not want to. "Louis, can you hear me?" He made a sound that was not quite a word. His eyes opened and they found her face, and something happened in his expression that was confused and pained and then somehow relieved, all in the span of 2 seconds. "Winifred," he said. His voice was rough but present. "Don't move," she said. "Let me check you first." She worked through him methodically: skull, neck, spine, ribs, abdomen, limbs. He had a significant gash along his left temple from the fall. He had cracked at least 2 ribs on his right side based on the way he flinched when she pressed there, and his left ankle was badly sprained or fractured at the distal end. The most serious concern was his head. The gash was deep and he had certainly hit the rock hard, and she needed to watch him carefully for signs of concussion. "How bad?" he asked, watching her face. "Your horse will walk off this ledge before you will," she said. "Concussion risk, cracked ribs, and your ankle is broken or close to it. You are not going to the front of this drive." The look on his face at that told her how much he hated hearing it. "Hector can take the front," she said, closing the gash in his temple with 4 stitches that she placed with her usual steadiness while he sat very still and watched her work. "Your job right now is to not move your head quickly and to do exactly what I tell you." "You are very bossy for an employee," he said. "You are very uncooperative for a patient," she said, and she heard him try to laugh and then stop because of the ribs, and the sound he made was pained and also, somehow, impossibly tender. She stayed beside him for the rest of that day, and Hector Vega did in fact take the front of the drive with the steady competence that she had expected from him, and the drive moved on and Louis moved with it but slowly, riding carefully in deference to his ribs and his head, with Winifred riding alongside him whether he wanted her there or not. He wanted her there. She could tell because he was a man who said what he meant, and at one point in the afternoon when she had been quiet for a while, watching the trail and watching him simultaneously, he said, "I am glad you are here." She did not say anything for a moment. The mountain was very large around them and very quiet except for the distant sound of the cattle and the wind in the pines. "So am I," she said finally, and it was the most honest thing she had said to him yet, and they both knew that it meant more than the words carried on their surface. The drive reached the mountain valley grazing land on the 10th day, and Louis's head had not shown the signs of serious concussion that she had been watching for, and his ribs were healing the way ribs healed, slowly and with discomfort, and his ankle had turned out to be a bad sprain rather than a fracture, which was the best possible news from that ledge. She wrapped it tight each morning, and he wore a boot 1 size larger to accommodate the wrapping, and he walked with a careful gait that was the only visible concession he made to the injury. On the 11th night, with the cattle settled in the valley and the hands spread across a wider camp and the mountains enormous and silver in the moonlight, Louis Shelby came and sat beside her at her fire again, and this time there was a different quality to the silence between them, charged in a way that she had been aware of building for days and had told herself she was misreading, because misreading it was safer. He was not a man who made small talk as a prelude. She was not a woman who pretended not to know what she knew. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask it. When the drive is done and we get back to the Double Horn," he stopped, and it was the first time she had seen him stop in the middle of a sentence, had seen him searching for words instead of choosing them cleanly. "I want you to stay, not just as the ranch physician. I want you to stay." The fire shifted. The mountains held their silence. "What are you saying?" she said, because she needed him to say it clearly. She was not a woman who accepted implications when there were words available. "I am saying that I have not felt like this about anyone since Clara," Louis said, "and I was not sure I would again. I am saying that you are the most remarkable person I have met in a long time, and every day since you walked into my office and told me I needed you, I have been aware of you the way I am aware of weather constantly, and as something that matters a great deal." Winifred was quiet. The thing she had been trying not to feel for 3 weeks was sitting right there in her chest with nowhere to hide, and she was too honest and too tired of hiding things to keep holding the door against it. "I am not Clara," she said carefully. "I know that," he said. I am not asking for Clara. I am asking for you. I am difficult, she said. I will always choose a patient over a social obligation. I have opinions about nearly everything and I express them. I carry a revolver and I know how to use it. I'm not going to stop working because someone expects me to. I know all of that, he said. I hired you. I am telling you so that you understand what you are asking for. I understand what I am asking for, Lewis said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent weeks decoding, and what was in them now was absolutely clear and absolutely serious. I am asking for exactly who you are, not a version of you that is smaller or more convenient. You. The thing in her chest that had been pressing against the door she kept it behind finally went through it. She looked at the fire for a moment. She looked at the mountains. She looked at Lewis Shelby's face, which was honest and patient and waiting. I have been alone a long time, she said quietly. I am not entirely sure I remember how not to be. Neither do I, he said. We can figure it out. She reached across the space between them, and she put her hand over his scarred, capable hand that she had noticed on the very first day. And she felt him turn his palm up and close his fingers around hers. And that was all, just that. Just the simple, specific warmth of his hand around hers in the cold mountain air. And it was enough to be absolutely devastating. All right, she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles. And then they sat like that beside the fire for a long time, not talking very much. The mountains vast around them. And Winifred Shepherd felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt safe. The drive back down from the mountains took 3 days, and those 3 days had a different quality than the days going up. Not easier, exactly. The terrain was still difficult and the work was still hard. But there was something different in the light of it, something that had shifted. She rode near Lewis, and he rode near her, and the hands noticed and understood with the easy, unsentimental pragmatism of men who had enough experience of life to recognize something real when they saw it, and mostly left them to it. Hector Vega looked at her on the second day down with a slow, satisfied nod that said everything and nothing. They arrived back at the Double Horn on a Friday afternoon in June, dusty and tired and sunburned and satisfied. And Mrs. Otero came out of the house and looked at Lewis and looked at Winifred and looked at the way they were riding, and she went inside again quickly. And when they came in for dinner that evening, the table was set with a tablecloth that Winifred had not seen before, and there were wildflowers in a jar on the sideboard. And she caught Mrs. Otero's eye, and Mrs. Otero looked the other way with a small private smile that Winifred decided she was going to pretend she had not seen, because some things were better acknowledged indirectly. The summer that followed was the most remarkable season of Winifred Shepherd's life, and she was a woman who had had remarkable seasons. Her work on the ranch continued with the fullness and substance that she had always wanted her work to have. The ranch hand's overall health improved steadily as she addressed the long backlog of neglected conditions and established a regular practice of examination and treatment that most of them submitted to with varying degrees of reluctant grace. She was called out twice more for emergencies, once for a horse that had kicked a man in the ribs badly enough to require drainage of a hemothorax, a procedure she performed in the barn with Lewis holding the lamp and watching with the calm, unflappable attention of a man who trusted what he was watching even when it was difficult. And once for a crisis in the nearest town, Caldwell, when she was asked by the town doctor who was there to assist with a difficult surgery. She went, and she was useful, and she came back to the Double Horn with a standing invitation to be called on when her skills were needed, which satisfied something deep in her that had never been fully satisfied by working in isolation. Between her and Lewis, things grew steadily, carefully, with the particular patience of two people who had both been hurt by loss and learned from it not to be careless. He did not rush her, and she did not rush herself. They talked in the evenings on the porch when the work was done, with coffee going cold in their cups because they kept forgetting to drink it, talking about things that mattered and things that did not matter and the distinction between the two. and she learned that he had an unexpectedly wide-ranging mind that had been educated mostly by reading and by experience, that he had opinions about land policy and water rights, and the treatment of the Ute people whose territory these mountains had originally been, and that his opinions were thoughtful rather than reflexive, formed from observation rather than inherited unexamined from the surrounding culture. He had employed Ute scouts in the early years of the ranch when he was learning the mountain passes, and he spoke of them with the respect of someone who had paid attention to what he was taught rather than dismissing his teachers because of who they were. She talked to him about medicine the way she had never been able to talk about it with anyone about what she understood of how the body worked, about the new findings coming out of Europe about germ theory and sterile technique that she had been reading in the medical journals she ordered by mail to Denver and had forwarded to the ranch, about what she hoped medical practice would look like in 20 years if the profession took the science seriously. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was following her, and she was not accustomed to being listened to that way, not about medicine, not by someone who had no professional reason to pay attention. In August, on a Sunday when the ranch was quiet, he took her riding up into the pines on the ridge behind the house, just the two of them, up to a place where the trees thinned, and you could see the whole valley below and the mountains in every direction, enormous and blue and endless, and it was evening and the light was gold, and he stopped his horse beside hers and they sat there together for a long time without speaking, and then he said her name quietly, just Winifred, just that. And when she turned to look at him, he kissed her. It was a serious, honest kiss, the kind that carries its own weight and does not apologize for being what it is, and she put her hand against his jaw and kissed him back with the same seriousness and honesty, and the mountains kept their silence around them, and it felt exactly like what it was, something inevitable and long-earned and completely right. He said against her mouth quietly, when they finally stopped, "I have wanted to do that since you told me I needed you, and I realized you were correct." She laughed, which surprised her, because she was not usually a person who laughed easily, and he smiled at the sound of it, and the smile changed his face in a way that she was going to carry with her for a very long time. They rode back down in the dark, unhurried, letting the horses pick their way carefully, and she felt as close to content as she had felt in years, which was its own slightly terrifying thing, because she had not been entirely sure she was still capable of it. September came, and with September came a letter. The letter was not from Louis's sister in Missouri, which was where she had been expecting the next letter in the household to originate. The letter was addressed to Winifred, in a handwriting she did not recognize, from a lawyer's office in Denver. She opened it in her medical room with the door closed, because letters from lawyers were rarely routine, and she was right about that. The letter informed her that a Dr. Cyrus Payne, who had held a medical license to practice in the Colorado Territory, had filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Medical Board against a person practicing medicine without license, described in the complaint as a woman calling herself W. Shepard, operating in Hatcher County. The letter was informing her that a hearing had been scheduled and that she was required to appear and to demonstrate the basis for her practice. She sat with that letter for a long time. She was not particularly surprised. Dr. Cyrus Payne was the town physician in Caldwell whom she had assisted with the surgery in July, and she had understood even during that assistance that he had an ego that did not enjoy being shown that a woman could do what he could do. She had seen the look on his face when she had caught his surgical error mid-procedure and corrected it, and she had seen him absorb that correction with a rigid, whitened jaw that spoke of a man who would not forget it. What she was not sure of was what she was going to do about it. She did not have a medical license from the Colorado Territory. She had never tried to obtain one, because the process for doing so had been, effectively, closed to women. The licensing board required examination by and approval of the Territorial Medical College, which did not admit women to its examination process. She had known this when she came west. She had practiced anyway, because the alternative was that people died for lack of treatment, and she had placed her ability to help people over the risk of this kind of challenge, and now the risk had materialized. She did not tell Louis that evening. She told herself it was because she wanted to think it through first, which was partially true. The other part of the truth was that she was not accustomed to bringing her problems to someone else, and the habit of handling things alone was not simple to break. He found out 3 days later because Mrs. Otero, who had seen the letter come and had seen the way Winifred's face had looked when she came out of her room after reading it, told him in the gentle, oblique way that Mrs. Otero had of telling Louis things she thought he needed to know. He knocked on the door of her medical room that evening. "Tell me about the letter," he said when she opened it. She looked at him for a moment, and then she stood aside and let him in, and she told him. All of it: the complaint, the hearing, the lack of a territorial license, the reason she did not have one. She watched his face while she talked, watching for the thing she was half afraid of, the moment where he recalibrated what she was in light of this new information. What she saw instead was his jaw tightening, and then his eyes going to that focused, deliberate place they went when he was deciding something. "Payne filed that complaint because you caught his mistake," Louis said. "Most likely, yes. He is trying to run you out of practice because you are better at the work than he is." "That is my reading of the situation." "What do you need for the hearing?" She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The hearing, what do you need?" He said it the way he said things he had decided, with the flat certainty of someone who has moved past the consideration phase and into the action phase and is mildly surprised that other people have not kept up. "You need documentation of your training and your cases. You need witnesses who can speak to your practice. You need a lawyer. What else?" She stared at him. Something moved through her that was not quite surprise. She had been learning who he was for months, but it was something close to it, the particular quality of being seen and supported simultaneously. "I can handle," she began. "Winifred," he said, and his voice was very quiet and very certain. "Let me help you." The word "help" from his mouth in that tone, with the full weight of who he was behind it, was not a diminishment. It was not a suggestion that she could not do it herself. It was an offer from someone who had chosen to be in her corner, and there was a difference between those things that she had not fully understood until this moment. She sat down in her chair. She was quiet for a moment. She allowed herself to feel what she actually felt, which was not the practiced, professional stillness she usually presented, but something more unguarded than that, something that was very close to relief. "I have 12 years of case records," she said. "I kept records from the beginning because my father taught me that records were how you learned from your patients. I have letters from patients and supervisors at 2 Army outposts. I have a letter from the chief medical officer at Fort Garland that I worked with in '79. "That is a good start," Louis said. He sat down across from her. "I know a lawyer in Denver, Marcus Webb. He is a good man and an honest one, which is not always the same thing. He has handled difficult cases before. I am going to write to him tonight." "Louis, let me do this," he said. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The lamp between them was steady and warm. "All right," she said. The second time she had said those 2 words to him, and each time they meant something larger than they contained. He wrote to Marcus Webb that night. The lawyer's response arrived 10 days later, and it was thorough and practical, and gave her genuine cause for confidence. Webb had looked into the existing cases and precedents. There were not many, but there were some, where women had been allowed to present credentials before territorial boards in the face of licensing challenges, and his assessment was that her case was genuinely strong, provided they could demonstrate that the absence of a territorial license was the result of the board's own discriminatory process, rather than any deficiency in her knowledge or skill. This was true. They had the documentation to prove it, or most of it. The hearing was in October, in Denver. Louis drove her there himself, and they made the 2-day journey in his wagon with enough supplies for the trip, and without pretending that either of them was relaxed about where they were going. but with the particular comfort of two people who have decided to face things together. Marcus Webb was a compact, precise man in his 40s who shook Winifred's hand like she was a person and looked over her documentation with the rapid, absorptive attention of someone who was very good at his work. He spent 2 hours with her going over what she had, asking sharp questions, clarifying details, and at the end of those 2 hours he looked at Lewis and he looked at Winifred and he said, "They have no legitimate grounds. What they have is institutional habit and the specific grievance of one physician with a wounded ego. I have seen cases lost on both of those things before, but I do not expect that today, because the records you have brought are extraordinary." Winifred's records were, in fact, extraordinary. 12 years of careful notation, every patient, every procedure, every outcome, every complication and how it was managed. Because her father had taught her that you were obligated to the whole truth of your practice, not just the parts that reflected well-filled 4 leather-bound ledgers and a substantial collection of correspondence. She had delivered 63 babies. She had performed over 40 surgical procedures of varying complexity. She had documented 412 cases across the full range of medicine she had practiced. The documentation was meticulous and comprehensive, and reflected a medical career of depth and seriousness that could not be easily dismissed. The hearing before the Territorial Medical Board of Colorado in October of 1882 was not easy, and it was not short. Cyrus Payne was there in person, a tall man with side whiskers, and the particular kind of confidence that goes with never having been seriously challenged, and he made his complaint with the assured superiority of someone who expected the board to agree with him simply because he was the one speaking. He questioned her credentials, her training, her right to practice. He spoke about the dangers of unlicensed individuals practicing medicine, about standards and protections, about all the language of professional regulation that, when stripped of its specifics, was simply the language of exclusion. Marcus Webb presented her case with the careful, systematic precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and the board members, 5 men of varying ages, varying expressions, listened. Lewis was in the room, which he had no right to be in professionally, but he sat against the wall, and he was very still and very present, and she knew he was there without looking at him. She was examined directly on her medical knowledge. The board's physician asked questions, detailed, technical questions about anatomy and procedure and pharmacology, and she answered every one of them with the confidence of someone who had learned what she knew through 12 years of doing it, not just reading about it. She could feel the room shifting as she answered. She could feel the specific quality of attention that changes when people move from listening skeptically to listening, because what they are hearing is genuinely good. At the end of 4 hours, the board recessed. She stood in the hallway outside with Lewis and Marcus Webb, and she was very tired and very composed, and Lewis put his hand briefly on her shoulder, just that, just his hand, just a moment, and she put her own hand briefly over his. The board returned with an outcome that was not complete victory and was not defeat. They ruled that the complaint by Dr. Payne was insufficient to prohibit her practice, given the documented evidence of her credentials and competency. They also ruled that she was required to take the formal licensing examination, but they voted 4-1 to allow her to take it, which was itself a precedent, because women had not been permitted to sit for the examination before. Marcus Webb, Winifred understood afterward, had known that this was the outcome to push for, not an exception to the rules, but a change in them, small and specific but real. She took the examination in November. She passed it with the highest score recorded for that sitting, which she knew because the administrator told her in a tone that was slightly aggrieved and largely awed, and which she received with the steady, unsurprised equanimity of someone who had always known what she was capable of and had simply been waiting for the opportunity to prove it. The license arrived at the Double Horn Ranch by mail in December, addressed properly to Dr. Winifred Shepard, and Lewis was there when she opened it, standing in the kitchen where Mrs. Otero was making coffee, and when she unfolded the paper and held it in her hands, he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him for a long moment without speaking, and Mrs. Otero put the coffee pot down and looked very intently out the window at something that probably was not there. The Christmas of 1882 was quiet and genuine, which was Winifred's favorite kind. The ranch hands celebrated with the traditional, exuberant simplicity of men who worked hard and played hard, with a dinner that was far more elaborate than usual courtesy of Mrs. Otero's considerable culinary gifts, and music from a fiddle player among the hands, and a bottle of whiskey that was shared with careful attention to fairness. Louis gave gifts to every man on the ranch, practical gifts, well chosen, that told her he paid attention to who people were and what they needed. He gave Winifred a set of surgical instruments, the finest quality she had ever seen, ordered from an instrument maker in Philadelphia, and he had wrapped them in a cloth and presented them to her privately in the evening, and she had held them in her hands with the particular reverence that a skilled person has for excellent tools. She gave him a book she had found by chance in the Denver bookshop, a natural history of the Rocky Mountain region, lavishly illustrated, which she had known immediately upon seeing it was exactly what he would want, and when he opened it his face did the thing it did when he was moved and was not going to show it entirely, that slight change in the set of his jaw and the quality of his eyes, and he looked at her and said quietly, "How did you know?" "I pay attention," she said. He kissed her then, in the lamplight, with the book still in his hands, and she kissed him back, and she was thinking that she had spent 6 years becoming very good at being alone, and that she appeared to have found something better. He proposed to her in January, on an ordinary Tuesday, which was the part she loved most about it. Not a planned ceremony, not a dramatic gesture, just the two of them in the medical room where she was organizing her new instruments, and he had come to tell her something about the cattle and somehow had not told her about the cattle at all, had ended up sitting in the chair across from her in the way that he did when he was thinking something through, until finally he had said, "I would like to marry you, Winifred, if you want that." She looked at him over her instrument case. The winter light was flat and gray through the window. "Tell me what that looks like," she said. "I need you to say it clearly." "It looks like this," he said, and his voice was very direct and very serious. "You keep practicing medicine. You keep being exactly who you are. We share the house and the life and whatever comes with both of those things together. I am not asking you to be less. I am asking you to let me be with you while you are being exactly as much as you are." She was quiet for a long moment, and he waited, because he knew her well enough by now to know that she thought before she answered and that the waiting was worth it. "Yes," she said, "I want that." The wedding was in February, in the main room of the Double Horn house, because the temperature outside was 15 degrees, and no one was going to stand outdoors for a ceremony. The judge, who had ridden up from Caldwell for the occasion, seemed genuinely pleased to be there, as did the 43 ranch hands packed into the room in their cleanest clothes with their hair combed, as did Mrs. Otero, who was standing in the corner, crying in a completely unrestrained way that she had clearly decided required no apology. Winifred wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that she had bought in Denver, and which was practical and elegant in equal measure, exactly like everything else she owned. She wore her father's watch on a chain. She carried herself the way she always carried herself, with the particular straight-backed steadiness of someone who has survived a great deal and knows it. And when she stood beside Louis Shelby before the judge and he took her hand and looked at her with those gray eyes that were absolutely and completely certain, she felt something settle in her with the clean, definitive quality of something finally put in its right place. They were married by the time the sun set. The winter finished in the way that Colorado winters always finished, with long resistance and then a sudden, decisive warmth in March that broke the ice on the creek and pushed green things out of the ground. Winifred's practice expanded in the spring, she began making regular visits to Caldwell and to a smaller settlement called Pine Ridge, 12 miles to the east, where the lack of any medical presence had been a persistent problem, and where her arrival was received with the particular relief of people who have been doing without something essential for too long. Dr. Cyrus Payne, whose wounded pride had precipitated her licensing hearing, had not forgotten or forgiven, but the practical reality of the situation was that Winifred's work was making her reputation in the county and Payne's ego was making his, and the community tended to call for whoever they trusted, which increasingly was her. She bore him no particular malice. She had won fairly and she had moved on, which was what winning was for. Lewis rode with her sometimes when she made the circuit to Pine Ridge and back, on the longer days when he could afford the time away from the ranch. They rode side by side on those days and talked about everything and nothing, and she thought that she might never have known this was possible. This specific, companionable ease of being completely known by someone and choosing to be with them anyway, and being chosen in return. In June, a year after the cattle drive into the San Juan Mountains, she told him that she was pregnant. They were at the creek, which had gone down from its spring flood to a clear, fast run that caught the light in long, bright ripples, and she told him the way she told him everything, directly and without preface, watching his face. His face did the complicated thing it did when something mattered very much to him, the stillness first, and then the shift, and then something open and unguarded that she did not often see in him. "Are you all right?" he said, the first thing he asked, and the rightness of it went through her. "I am well," she said. "Physiologically speaking, I am in excellent health and I know exactly what this involves." He reached over and took her hand, his hand still scarred, still capable, still warm. "We are going to have a child," he said quietly in a way that was not a question. "We are going to have a child," she confirmed. He raised her hand to his lips, the same gesture he had made on the mountainside beside the fire a year ago, and she felt the same devastating simplicity of it. The pregnancy was straightforward, which she accepted with the practical gratitude of a physician who knew how many ways it could go otherwise. She continued her work modified in the later months to reduce the long rides, and she drove herself in the wagon to the closer patients, and had Lewis or one of the hands accompany her on the farther ones, which was a practical accommodation she made without embarrassment, because she had learned, slowly and unevenly, that accepting help was not the same as being diminished by it. The baby was born in January of 1884, a year after their wedding, in the bedroom of the house Lewis had built, in the cold, still hours of a winter night. Mrs. Otero and a midwife from Caldwell named Ruth Esterly were with her, and Lewis was in the house and trying very hard to be patient in the way that he tried very hard to be patient with anything beyond his control, which was with visible effort and not complete success. When Mrs. Otero came to the door of the main room and told him that he had a son and that his wife was well, the expression on Lewis Shelby's face was something that Mrs. Otero described later when telling the story as the look of a man who had been given back everything he had thought he would never have again, and then some. They named the baby Elias, for Winifred's father. Elias Shelby came into the world in the winter and grew through his first spring on the Double Horn with the wide, wondering attention of a baby, discovering that the world is very large and very interesting, which seemed appropriate, given who his parents were. He had Lewis's gray eyes and Winifred's stubborn, focused expression when something caught his attention, and he was a sturdy, cheerful baby who seemed to accept the constant activity of the ranch with the same equanimity his parents brought to most things. Lewis with the baby was something Winifred had not known she was going to find so completely undoing. He was entirely natural with him, large hands holding the small weight of him, with an instinctive care that she watched with a fullness in her chest she could not have named without embarrassing herself. He talked to Elias the way he talked to everyone, directly and seriously, as though the baby's opinion on the matter being discussed was genuinely sought. She came into the kitchen one morning to find Louis standing at the window with the baby propped against his shoulder, explaining something about the spring calving season in a quiet, even voice. And she stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and she thought, "This is what I was crossing those rivers for. This is what the road was leading to, even when I could not see it." The years that followed were full ones. The double horn continued to grow. Winifred's practice continued to grow with it. She made a formal arrangement with the county that gave her a small salary as county physician for the area not served by the Caldwell practice, which was the first such arrangement of its kind in that part of Colorado, and which required 3 separate negotiations with 3 separate officials who each had initial reservations that she addressed with the same calm, factual, unhurried force she brought to everything, until the reservations resolved themselves under the weight of the evidence. Louis sat through 2 of those negotiations uninvited and said almost nothing, but his presence was a statement in itself, that she had the full backing of the most significant ranching operation in Hatcher County, and that was not nothing, and they both knew it. In the summer of 1886, their second child arrived. A girl this time, with Winifred's brown hair and Louis's capacity for absolute stillness, which she exercised primarily in the direction of things she found interesting, which were many things. They named her Clara, and the naming was Winifred's suggestion, offered carefully and with full acknowledgement of what it meant, and Louis had taken that in with a long, quiet look that contained more than words could have carried, and had nodded once. Elias was 3 when his sister arrived, and received her with the solemn, proprietorial interest of a toddler who has been told about a new arrival, and has formed his own opinions about what this will entail. He inspected her with the serious, inquiring expression he had inherited from both of his parents and which he brought to every new phenomenon in his world, and then he looked at Louis and said, in the clear, direct way he was already learning to speak, "She is very small." "She is," Louis agreed. "Will she get bigger?" "She will." "Good," Elias said, apparently satisfied, and went back to the thing he had been doing before the inspection. Winifred, still in bed, still holding the baby, caught Louis's eye across the room, and they looked at each other with the particular, private, laughing tenderness of 2 people who are sharing the funniest and most extraordinary thing in the world, which is the existence of their children. The Double Horn Ranch in 1887 was a different place from the one Winifred had ridden into 5 years earlier on Reason the Mule, though the mountains behind it were the same, and the creek ran the same cold, clear line through the eastern meadow. The house had been added to the east wing, finally fully furnished and lived in. The medical room expanded into 2 rooms, a small library added adjacent to the parlor, because their combined book collection had long since overrun the available shelves. Winifred's medical bag hung on the hook by the door, same as it always had, ready. Her revolver hung beside it, same as it always had, because the frontier remained what it was and she remained what she was. She was 34 years old, and she had everything she had never allowed herself to plan for. On the anniversary of the cattle drive, 5 years since they had sat beside a fire in the San Juan Mountains with the stars enormous overhead, Louis took her back up the ridge behind the house to the place where the trees thinned, and you could see the whole valley below. It was evening, and the light was gold, the same way it had been gold the first time he had kissed her, and they sat side by side with their horses standing quiet behind them, and the mountains were in every direction, enormous and blue and forever. "Are you happy?" he said. It was the kind of question that would have made her impatient once. She would have deflected it or answered it technically or turned it back into something manageable. She did none of those things now. "Yes," she said, "completely." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they looked at the valley, at the ranch in the distance, at the particular arrangement of light and shadow on the mountains that she had been looking at for 5 years and still found moving, and she felt the complete, solid, irreducible fact of her life. Her work, her family, this man beside her, and she was glad of all of it, and she was glad of the road that had brought her here, even the long, hard parts of it. because every hard crossing and every solitary river and every difficult winter had been pointing in this direction the whole time. Even when she had not known, there was a direction to point toward. She had stitched wounds in firelight and pulled teeth from men twice her size and forded rivers alone in flood season, and all of it had been in preparation for this, not for a man to save her, because she had never needed saving, but for this, the life on the other side of all that surviving, the life where she was still exactly who she was and someone knew it completely and loved her for precisely that reason. The valley below was beginning to go bronze in the last light, and somewhere down in the ranch house, Elias was probably interrogating Mrs. Otero about something, and Clara was probably sleeping through it, and the mountains behind them were putting on their evening colors, and Louis Shelby's arm was warm around her shoulders, and Winifred Shepherd, licensed physician, Dr. Winifred Shepherd, had come to the end of a very long road and found that it led somewhere worth going. "Ride back with me," she said. "Always," he said. They rode down through the pines in the last of the evening light, unhurried, letting the horses pick their way along the familiar trail, and the ranch lights came up below them as the sky deepened, and the mountains stood in their ancient silence behind, and the road ahead was known and good, and it was enough. It was far more than enough. It was everything. She had once believed that going west alone was the hardest thing she would ever do. She had been wrong about that. It turned out the hardest thing was learning to arrive somewhere and stay. But she had done that too, and she had done it in the only way that had ever worked for her, completely and without apology and with the full force of who she was. And it had been enough. It had been exactly enough. The Double Horn Ranch stood in its valley under the Colorado night, and the mountains kept their long watch over it. And inside the house the children were in their beds, and Mrs. Otero's lamp was lit in the kitchen, and the fire was going in the parlor grate. And when Louis opened the door for her, she stepped through it into the warmth, and the door closed behind them both, and the night was very quiet and very full.